The night the neighborhood finally turned on her started with a busted sprinkler and a lawn chair in the middle of the cul-de-sac. I came home from a 12-hour shift, ready to collapse, and found a half-dozen strangers in my driveway laughing like they lived there. Music thumped from a Bluetooth speaker so loud it rattled the mailboxes. Empty beer cans glittered in the street like confetti. Someone had draped a blanket over my mailbox and used it as a prop for a selfie. When I walked up to the porch, a tall man with a baseball cap stared me down while a woman with a painted-on smile waved like she'd known me forever. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "This is my house. Relax," the tall man said. "We're with Karen. She said it was fine. She's inside the clubhouse." The clubhouse, of course. Karen had taken the HOA presidency like someone seizes a microphone at karaoke and refuses to hand it back. She ran the community's Facebook like she ran everything else, with a thin veneer of friendliness and an iron rulebook hidden in her purse. Everyone knew Karen liked parties, liked power, liked to be the first to hand out citations. People also knew that when Karen said something was okay, it usually meant she'd be the one to profit. "Who's Karen?" I asked. "You don't know Karen?" The woman with the painted-on smile said. She sounded genuinely shocked. "She owns the block. I didn't have time for a parade of strangers on my lawn." I started toward my gate to get them to leave. "It's not rocket science. Private property, private driveway." The man put a hand up like he was a referee. "Listen," I said, "you've got to go. This is private property." They scoffed. The tall man looked at the others and smiled. "She said it was okay," he repeated. So I went inside, grabbed my phone, and opened the HOA rules app. I wasn't a fan of our HOA, but I knew it better than most. The rules about clubhouse usage were clear: scheduled events only, no unauthorized gatherings after dark, guests must be registered, and parking restrictions were enforced on a first complaint basis. Karen's clubhouse bookings were always suspicious. Late-night meetings that turned into bonfires. Potlucks turned into open parties. I had complained before, and all it ever got me was a passive-aggressive message from Karen about neighborhood spirit. I went back outside and explained the rules to them. Calm but firm. They laughed again, and one of the guests, an idiot with a half-shaved beard, said, "She told us to take a seat anywhere. This whole place is public." "Not true," I said. "You've got to leave, now." They kept laughing. The man in the cap stood up slowly, blocking my way. Tension that had been simmering in the cul-de-sac for months boiled into a moment that felt like it might explode. I told them I would call the police if they didn't get out. The bearded idiot reached into his pocket like he was pulling a phone, and for 1 second I thought we were doing the 60-second debate we'd already had a dozen times in small American towns. Who called whom and whose rights mattered? Then Karen came out of the clubhouse like royalty stepping onto a balcony. Her black dress was immaculate. Her hair was an announcement. She held a wine glass like it was a scepter. "What's the problem?" Karen asked, voice smooth as silk. Her eyes flicked to me with the familiarity of someone who thinks she knows me better than I know myself. I explained. She laughed, loud and precise. "Oh, sweetheart, don't be silly. These are my guests. Have a heart. It's just a party. Don't be the neighborhood grump." I reminded her of the rules. She arched an eyebrow. "Those rules are for the commoners," she said, as if quoting a joke. "I run this HOA, remember?" Several neighbors came out of their houses to see the commotion. Most of them had experienced some version of Karen's remember before. A few rolled their eyes, some tried to duck back inside. A kid on a skateboard zipped by and yelled, "Karen's having another one!" and the cul-de-sac hummed with a nervous energy. I told Karen I was going to make a formal complaint if the guests didn't leave. She put a hand on the tall man's shoulder and said, "Don't be ridiculous. Call the cops if you want. I promise you they'll tell you to settle down and go inside." So I did what I said I would. I dialed. I explained the situation. An officer said they'd send someone to check it out and to remain calm. While I waited, Karen stepped forward, her smile now icy. "I'd advise you to think very carefully about what you do next," she said softly. I didn't get where I am by being naive. One of her guests, the bearded man, lunged at me and grabbed my arm as if to steer me away. I pulled free and shoved him back. It was a small shove, nothing heroic. Just enough to create space and stop momentum. He fell into a lawn ornament and cursed. "See?" the tall man said. "He attacked you." "Yeah," another guest chimed in. "Call the cops, see what happens." Before I could get a word in, one of Karen's guests pulled out a phone and called 911 with dramatic over-enunciation. Karen put on a look of offended civility and raised her hands. "They're harassing my guests," she said. loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm the HOA president. I demand protection." When the patrol car arrived, 2 officers in reflective vests stepped out, scanning the chaotic scene. Karen put on her most modest expression and told them the story she'd rehearsed. She was hosting friends, the homeowner had become aggressive, and she feared for her guests. She was good at telling this story. She had practiced the inflection that made her sound like a victim. I told my side. I handed one officer a screenshot of our HOA's charter from the app showing the clubhouse rules and evidence that no event was scheduled. I showed photos I'd taken of the gathering on my driveway. The officer listened politely, then asked if anyone was hurt. The bearded man put on a dramatic performance, clutching his arm like he'd been mauled. Karen asked the officers to remove me from the premises. The officers did something mediators do when they want to avoid trouble. They offered equal doses of caution. They told everyone to disperse and to go inside for the night. They took basic statements. No one was arrested. Karen thanked the officers and smiled like she'd won. I filed a formal complaint with the HOA the next morning. I uploaded the photos, the screenshots, and a polite detailed account where I explicitly requested an emergency hearing. The HOA board software acknowledged the complaint and set up a meeting for next week. I thought that would be the end of it. In my mind, the rules were clear, the evidence obvious, and fairness would prevail. It did not. Karen turned my complaint into a crusade. She posted in the neighborhood forum about the rude homeowner who'd bullied her guests and assaulted a man. She tagged neighbors and attached a grainy photo of me standing in my yard, taken that night. She wrote about safety, community standards, and the need to protect clubhouse access. Her post filled the feed with sympathetic comments and a few nasty private messages that painted me as a troublemaker. An emergency meeting was scheduled, but Karen insisted it be handled by the board's ad hoc committee, which she chaired. She controlled the agenda, the guest list, the time, and, crucially, the minutes. She submitted a packet describing the incident in theatrical terms and demanded I be fined for harassment and intimidation. The packet included a neighbor's anonymous statement, someone without a name, just a phone number, that claimed I'd been aggressive and unhinged. The board, which had spent months getting used to Karen's tone, voted to table the matter for 2 weeks. 2 weeks went by. Karen ramped up a PR campaign. She printed flyers. She accused me in person at the mailbox. I started getting nasty notes left on my doorstep, "You'll be sorry," and warnings about not making waves. I felt the pressure of small-town vendettas boiling into something uglier. I could have paid a lawyer and tried to fight in the usual way. I could have complained to the police about harassment. Instead, I took a more surgical route. I had an advantage Karen didn't expect: patience and records. First, I dug into the HOA's public filings at the county office. Karen had been savvy about paperwork in a way that showed ambition but not legality. I found receipts showing she'd been charging event fees to visitors and pocketing parts of those fees through a shell company. I found contracts she'd made for landscaping with an outfit owned by her cousin. I discovered invoices that didn't match services rendered, payments made to a post office box instead of to a licensed vendor. If these invoices were true, they suggested misuse of HOA funds and self-dealing, and that's the kind of violation boards are terrified of. Second, I collected witnesses. The neighbor who mowed my lawn sometimes used Karen's services for babysitting. She told me she was tired of Karen's bullying and would testify to seeing money change hands at private meetings. Another neighbor, an elderly man named Ray, had a key to the clubhouse and handed me a stack of old sign-in sheets that showed dozens of private events that had never been registered with the HOA system. A landscaper who used to work for the HOA told me over coffee that Karen frequently demanded cash for emergency supplies and that receipts never followed. I kept everything organized in a digital folder labeled with dates, timestamps, and scanned documents. I made copies and backups. I learned how HOA bylaws worked, the thresholds needed to call a special meeting, and the legal grounds for recall. It was boring legal homework, but it was satisfying in a way that felt productive. I approached the board with a simple demand: an independent audit. I submitted a formal request, citing specific discrepancies and asking that the auditing firm be chosen by a neutral committee. Karen dismissed it as petty theatrics. She mocked me at the next board meeting for accusing her without proof. Her voice was loud and theatrical, but she had no paperwork to disprove the records I'd started to pull together. The board hesitated. Karen had allies, people who benefited from the convenience of her arrangements, but she also had enemies. The more I pushed, the more cracks appeared. A couple of board members confessed privately that they'd been uncomfortable with her methods. They didn't want to be part of a scandal, and they were worried about liability, so I called a special meeting. Bylaws allowed any petition signed by 10% of homeowners to force a special election. I spent weekends knocking on doors. I explained what I'd found: neutral facts, photocopies, receipts. Some neighbors were furious, others skeptical, but many had had their own run-ins with Karen. People started showing me messages they'd received, fines they'd been charged for trivial things, and records of denied clubhouse reservations that mysteriously popped back into Karen's calendar. Within 3 weeks, I had enough signatures to trigger a special meeting and a recall vote. The notice went out with a short agenda: vote on whether to remove Karen from the HOA presidency pending an independent audit. Karen responded the only way she knew how: publicly and loudly. She sent an email to every homeowner accusing me of a smear campaign and claiming the signatures were forged. She demanded proof. I delivered the proof. On the day of the meeting, the room at the community center was packed. People who had once nodded politely to Karen now sat with arms folded, watching her like a performer they had grown tired of. I opened with a plain statement: I would not speak for long. I handed out copies of every document I had: bank records, canceled checks, invoices, and the sign-in sheets Ray had found. I explained the timeline and asked the board to appoint an independent auditor. Karen stood up, red-faced, and accused me of character assassination. She threatened to sue. She leaned into theatrics until it felt like we were back in the cul-de-sac at midnight. But then came the quiet moment that would change everything. The auditor's CEO, who had been invited by a neutral board member, stood and asked to speak. He described a simple audit procedure. He explained what self-dealing meant and how common it was for officers to slip payments through layers that hid personal profit. He asked the room for permission to start a limited review of the HOA's past 2 years of finances. The motion passed with a clear majority. Karen sputtered and protested, but the vote was recorded and the room resounded with a sound I hadn't heard in that community in years: consensus. The audit took 3 weeks. Karen tried to stall. She claimed records were lost. She accused the auditors of bias. She demanded subpoenas for bank statements. The audit, thankfully, was thorough. It documented payments routed through shell accounts, event fees that never made it into HOA ledgers, invoices for non-existent landscaping work, and, most damning, a series of checks written to Karen's personal account labeled as Clubhouse Upkeep. When the audit results were presented to the community, the room went quiet. The numbers were ugly and precise. Karen's protests grew thin and edged with desperation. She'd built her power by bilking the community and by intimidating anyone who noticed. She tried to argue it was a misunderstanding, a mistake. She offered to reimburse funds. The board had no choice but to call for her immediate suspension pending further legal review. But suspension wasn't enough for some people. Several neighbors who had been quietly bullied into silence for years stood up and read their testimony aloud. Fines levied for trivial things. Playground equipment taken down because Karen said it. Was an eyesore: evicted tenants who couldn't pay a sudden increase in HOA dues that went straight into Karen's hands. The board, shaken, voted unanimously to strip her of office and to launch a criminal referral. Karen cried foul. She accused me of orchestrating a witch hunt. She claimed the audit was biased because she had opposed it, but the ledger didn't care about her excuses. It was a ledger, not a personality. The police investigated. I cooperated fully. In the meantime, Karen's charismatic hold unraveled. People who had once thanked her for keeping things in order now wanted restitution. The HOA filed a lawsuit to recover misappropriated funds and to ban Karen from serving on the board ever again. She fought back, of course. Lawyers and threats and a public relations campaign. But momentum had shifted. A month later, the special election confirmed the board's actions. Karen's removal was ratified by a powerful majority. The community breathed like people exhaling after holding their breath underwater too long. They talked about what to rebuild. They talked about bylaws and transparency, about posting minutes and rotating responsibilities so no one could seize them again. They set up an independent oversight committee and tightened audit schedules. As for me, I expected a triumphant, gloating moment. Instead, the victory felt strange and hollow. The person I'd been for weeks, meticulous, combative, sleepless, shrunk back into someone who liked a quiet house and a reliable sleep schedule. I got back to my life, fixed the dent in my mailbox, and mowed my lawn the Sunday after the election because it felt like the right thing to do. On moving day, Karen packed up not just her office, but her reputation. She left with a final Facebook post that blamed haters and promised legal retribution. The police case continued, and a judge eventually ordered restitution and a bar from HOA duties. Some neighbors still miss the sense of drama she'd provided, the kind that makes everyone feel like they're living in a soap opera, but most of us preferred the gray hum of normalcy. Weeks later, I saw the tall man from the driveway outside the library, staring at a bench like he had nowhere else to be. He gave me a sheepish nod and told me he'd moved away from the neighborhood. The bearded idiot had been fined for trespassing and had to do community service. Karen's guests disappeared, as if someone had turned down the volume on their lives. What surprised me was how ordinary the aftermath was. People came by to say thank you, some muttering, some hugs. A few neighbors who had been neutral now smiled when they saw me at the mailbox. An elderly woman baked a pie and left it at my door with a note. Thank you for not letting her push us around. I didn't do it alone. I had documents, signatures, neighbors who were tired of being bossed. I had patience and a willingness to learn the slow, bureaucratic language of audits and bylaws. Karen had built a house on favors and fear, and it took organized transparency to knock it down. Sometimes I still see her in the grocery store, a flash of black hair and a look that says she thinks the world owes her an explanation. I say hello politely. She doesn't respond. The neighborhood is quieter now. The clubhouse has a new, transparent booking policy and a calendar that the community can see. The board posts minutes every month. There were bumps. A suspicious vendor popped up once. A petty fine was issued for a holiday display. But the system held because people were watching. People who had been too afraid to speak now spoke. That was the real change. I learned a lot from the whole mess. Power is seductive and small communities are easy prey. Systems that don't rotate leadership become plantations of personality. Standing up doesn't mean getting into a screaming match at midnight. It means taking notes, collecting receipts, finding witnesses, and turning private anger into public process. It means doing the boring work, forms, signatures, follow-ups, that makes justice a practice rather than a fantasy. The night Karen came storming out in her black dress, I could have called a lawyer. Instead, I organized. That was the difference between being bullied and being a neighbor who holds the line. And when the police came for the second time, it wasn't because I'd been violent or dramatic. It was because the community finally demanded they look into the books. If you ever find yourself on the wrong end of a small-town tyrant, here is something practical. Keep records. Save every receipt, photo, and message. Learn the bylaws. Talk to your neighbors. Be courteous, but be persistent. Power recedes when it is exposed to sunlight. When the neighborhood threw a little block party months later to celebrate the new board, Karen's old followers didn't show. Instead, families brought potlucks and kids wrestled on the grass. Someone put up a sign, community garden rules, no overnight camping, be respectful of others. The sign looked boringly good and sensible. It was a victory not announced with fanfare, but with a hose turned on a sprinkler, a lawn chair set straight, and a mailbox standing where it belonged.